Westwood Academy, a prestigious institution, hides a troubling undercurrent of prejudice behind its polished reputation. Nadia Lewis, a new student, steps into an English classroom led by Mrs. Anderson, a teacher whose biases threaten to undermine her potential. What begins as subtle exclusion escalates into open hostility, with Mrs. Anderson targeting Nadia for her courage in addressing critical themes of injustice. But when the truth comes to light, and Nadia's father, Principal Lewis, steps in, the school is forced to confront its own shortcomings. Through resilience and determination, Nadia sparks a wave of change, transforming the school into a more inclusive and compassionate community. This is a tale of bravery, justice, and the power of standing up for what's right, even when the odds are against you. Before we dive into this gripping tale of courage and transformation, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this inspiring and thought-provoking story, don't forget to subscribe. Westwood Academy was renowned for its academic rigor and high standards, a place where excellence was expected in every corner. Yet beneath its polished exterior lay unspoken prejudices, veiled by the institution's commitment to discipline and order. In one such corner, the English classroom of Mrs. Anderson, a teacher known for her strict demeanor, a new story was about to unfold. The bell rang sharply, signaling the beginning of the school day. Students shuffled into Mrs. Anderson's classroom, the air tinged with a mixture of apprehension and routine. Her classroom had earned a reputation for being particularly demanding. With her piercing gaze and unyielding standards, Mrs. Anderson commanded respect or fear from her students. As the last few students hurried into their seats, a new presence filled the doorway. Nadia Lewis, a transfer student, stepped in, her backpack slung casually over one shoulder. Her calm expression gave away little, but the energy in the room shifted. Her classmates' eyes turned toward her, some curious, others guarded. "Ah," Mrs. Anderson said, her voice laced with a sweetness that felt artificial. "Our new student. I hope you'll be able to keep up with our challenging curriculum." She emphasized the word challenging in a way that felt less like a welcome and more like a warning. Nadia met Mrs. Anderson's gaze steadily but chose not to respond. She moved toward an empty seat near the back, her footsteps deliberate and composed. As Mrs. Anderson turned to the whiteboard, the atmosphere in the room grew heavier. Nadia began unpacking her materials, but her keen awareness told her this wasn't going to be an ordinary day. "Now," Mrs. Anderson announced, snapping the class back to attention, "today we'll be analyzing themes of power and morality in To Kill a Mockingbird. Let's start with a discussion. Who can share their thoughts on how the story portrays authority?" Several hands went up, but Nadia, eager to contribute, raised hers as well. Mrs. Anderson's gaze skimmed the classroom, her eyes deliberately avoiding Nadia's hand. She called on other students one by one, encouraging them to elaborate, while Nadia's hand remained raised. Finally, when most had spoken, Mrs. Anderson's eyes landed reluctantly on Nadia. "Miss Lewis," she said, her tone sharp, "do you have something to add?" Nadia straightened in her seat, her voice calm but firm. "I believe the novel examines how systemic injustice is perpetuated through societal norms and structures of power." A flicker of tension crossed Mrs. Anderson's face. She interjected before Nadia could elaborate further. "Systemic injustice? Let's not conflate this classic piece of literature with modern political narratives," she said with a hint of condescension. The classroom fell silent. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats while a few exchanged knowing glances. Nadia's fingers tightened around her pen, but her expression remained composed. "With all due respect," Nadia began, her voice steady, "the book reflects the racial inequalities of its time, which are—" "That's enough," Mrs. Anderson interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. "Let's stick to what the author intended rather than imposing your interpretations." A ripple of unease swept through the room. The message was clear. Nadia's perspective wasn't welcome. Yet she refused to retreat, her quiet determination unsettling the teacher even further. The lesson continued, and Mrs. Anderson ignored Nadia's hand every time it rose. Her deliberate exclusion didn't go unnoticed by the other students. Some appeared uneasy, darting sympathetic glances in Nadia's direction, while others seemed to enjoy the unfolding drama. As the class neared its end, Mrs. Anderson announced an upcoming group project. "I will be assigning the groups," she declared, her tone leaving no room for debate. We wouldn't want anyone to feel out of place. The implications in her words hung heavy in the air. Nadia caught the veiled challenge in Mrs. Anderson's gaze and squared her shoulders in response. The bell rang, and students began gathering their things. Nadia moved with deliberate slowness, her calm masking the storm brewing within. As she reached the door, Mrs. Anderson's voice called out, "Miss Lewis, a word, please." Nadia paused, turning back to face the teacher. Her expression betrayed nothing. "Yes, Mrs. Anderson?" The teacher's smile was tight, her tone clipped. "I want to remind you that in this class, we focus on critical analysis, not personal agendas. You do well to remember that." For a moment, Nadia said nothing, her gaze steady on Mrs. Anderson's. Then, with a calm confidence that belied the tension in the air, she replied, "Of course. I look forward to demonstrating my analysis skills in our next discussion." With that, Nadia walked out, leaving Mrs. Anderson momentarily at a loss for words. The teacher's lips pressed into a thin line, her resolve hardening. The following days at Westwood Academy unfolded under a cloud of growing unease. Nadia Lewis entered Mrs. Anderson's English classroom with her head held high, her composed demeanor masking the quiet determination brewing inside her. However, Mrs. Anderson had no intention of easing the tension. The air was thick with anticipation as Mrs. Anderson began the lesson. Her sharp gaze swept across the room, narrowing slightly when it landed on Nadia. The teacher's tone was clipped as she addressed the class. "Let's begin with yesterday's reading. Miss Lewis," she said suddenly, her voice carrying an edge, "can you summarize the key themes from Chapter 12? Nadia looked up, momentarily caught off guard. Mrs. Anderson had made a point of avoiding her contributions until now. She collected herself quickly, her voice calm as she replied, "Certainly, Chapter 12 highlights the intersection of moral courage and societal prejudice, particularly through the character of—" "Stop right there," Mrs. Anderson interrupted, her lips curling into a tight smile. "Moral courage? Perhaps you're overcomplicating the author's intent. Let's stick to simpler observations, shall we?" A murmur rippled through the room. Some students glanced at Nadia with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort, while others smirked, seemingly entertained by the exchange. Nadia clenched her hands beneath the desk, forcing herself to remain composed. "As I was saying," she continued, her voice unwavering, "the chapter explores how individuals navigate systemic challenges, often requiring great personal sacrifice to uphold their values." Mrs. Anderson's expression hardened, but she said nothing further, turning instead to the whiteboard. The rest of the lesson carried on, punctuated by subtle jabs at Nadia's participation. During a group discussion later that day, the class was tasked with analyzing the symbolism of the mockingbird. Nadia raised her hand, prepared to share her thoughts, but before she could speak, Mrs. Anderson interjected. "Miss Lewis," she said, her tone dripping with condescension, "if you're going to contribute, please ensure your remarks are relevant and well supported. We don't want any misunderstandings, do we?" A few students chuckled nervously. Nadia's face remained composed, though her knuckles whitened as her grip on her pen tightened. "I'll do my best," Nadia replied evenly, refusing to let the taunt rattle her. She began to speak, but before she could finish her point, Mrs. Anderson interrupted again, this time with a sharp critique. "Your diction could use some refinement, Miss Lewis. It's important to communicate clearly in an academic setting." The comment hung in the air, its thinly veiled insult clear to everyone in the room. A collective silence followed, broken only by the faint rustling of papers. One student, Michael, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his brow furrowing. Another, Elena, shot Nadia a small, sympathetic glance. The rest of the class avoided eye contact, their discomfort palpable. The bell rang, marking the end of the period. Nadia gathered her belongings with deliberate care, her movements slow and controlled. As she reached the door, Mrs. Anderson's voice stopped her once again. "Miss Lewis, a moment, please." Nadia turned back, her face a mask of calm. "Yes, Mrs. Anderson?" The teacher's smile was tight and insincere. "I noticed your participation today. While I appreciate the enthusiasm, it's important to remember that this class values structured evidence-based analysis. Personal interpretations can sometimes cloud objective understanding." "I understand," Nadia said, her voice even. "I'll continue to support my analysis with textual evidence." Mrs. Anderson's lips twitched as though she was unsatisfied with the response. "Good," she said curtly. "See that you do." As Nadia left the classroom, she felt the weight of her classmates' stares. Some avoided her gaze, while others seemed intrigued by the unfolding dynamic. The next day brought a fresh challenge. Mrs. Anderson, determined to assert her authority, intensified her scrutiny of Nadia. From the moment the lesson began, it was clear she was looking for any opportunity to find fault. "Miss Lewis," Mrs. Anderson said sharply, "is that gum I see in your mouth?" Nadia blinked, momentarily confused. "No, Mrs. Anderson, I'm not." "Don't lie to me," Mrs. Anderson snapped, cutting her off. "Spit it out this instant." Nadia's classmates froze, the tension in the room palpable. Slowly, Nadia stood, walked to the trash can, and mimed spitting out imaginary gum. She returned to her seat, her movements deliberate and composed. The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Anderson's expression remained stony as she resumed the lesson, but the shift in classroom dynamics was impossible to ignore. Later, during another discussion, Nadia raised her hand once more. This time, Mrs. Anderson's interruption was more blatant than ever. "Miss Lewis," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "could you please enunciate more clearly? We can't all understand certain dialects." A collective gasp rippled through the classroom. Nadia's face remained impassive, though her hands clenched into fists beneath the desk. The insult was undeniable, and the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Nadia's response. "Of course," Nadia replied evenly, her voice steady. "I'll make an effort to be as clear as possible." The class ended in a tense silence, and as Nadia gathered her materials, Mrs. Anderson called out yet again. "Miss Lewis, stay behind, please." Nadia approached the desk, her heart pounding, but her expression calm. "I hope you understand," Mrs. Anderson began, "that your attitude is becoming a problem. If you can't adapt to the standards of this class, perhaps you should consider whether this environment is the right fit for you." Nadia took a deep breath, her voice low but resolute. "I understand perfectly, Mrs. Anderson. I'll continue to meet the standards as I always have." Mrs. Anderson's lips thinned into a tight smile. "Good. And don't forget, your group project presentation is due next week. I expect it to be flawless." Nadia nodded, her mind already racing with preparations. She knew the presentation would be a turning point, and she was determined not to let Mrs. Anderson win. The day of Nadia Lewis's group project presentation arrived, and the tension in Mrs. Anderson's English classroom was almost unbearable. Students sat nervously, their eyes darting between Nadia and their teacher. They could sense that today would be different. An inevitable confrontation loomed on the horizon. Nadia stood at the front of the classroom, her project board carefully prepared and her notes meticulously organized. The topic of her presentation, an analysis of To Kill a Mockingbird, focused on the themes of racial injustice and moral courage. She took a deep breath, steadying herself as she faced her classmates. Her voice was clear and composed as she began. "Today, I'll be discussing how To Kill a Mockingbird explores the moral complexities of standing against systemic prejudice, using examples from the text and supporting them with scholarly interpretations." Mrs. Anderson sat at her desk, her pen tapping rhythmically against her clipboard. Her expression was unreadable, but her gaze was fixed on Nadia like a hawk watching its prey. As Nadia moved through her presentation, she answered questions with confidence, citing specific passages from the book and referencing literary critiques. Her classmates seemed genuinely engaged, nodding along as she spoke. But halfway through the presentation, Mrs. Anderson raised her hand. "Miss Lewis," she began, her tone deceptively sweet, "I'm curious about your decision to focus so heavily on racial themes. Don't you think you're overemphasizing one aspect of the novel and neglecting its broader literary merits?" Nadia's brow furrowed slightly, but she maintained her composure. "I believe the racial themes are central to understanding the book's message, Mrs. Anderson. Harper Lee herself said that." "I'm well aware of what Harper Lee said," Mrs. Anderson interrupted, her voice sharp. "But I find it troubling that you seem unable to see beyond your personal biases. This is supposed to be an academic analysis, not a platform for social commentary." A gasp rippled through the classroom. Nadia's hands clenched at her sides, and for a moment the carefully constructed wall of calm she had maintained began to crack. But instead of lashing out, she took a deep breath and replied evenly. With respect, my analysis is based on textual evidence and supported by reputable sources. The themes of racial injustice are integral to the novel's narrative and cannot be separated from its broader message. Mrs. Anderson's chair scraped loudly as she stood, moving to the front of the room. She positioned herself between Nadia and the class, her posture imposing. "Let me make something clear, Miss Lewis," she said, her voice rising. "This relentless focus on race is not only disruptive but also demonstrates a lack of understanding. Perhaps in your previous school, such narrow interpretations were acceptable, but here we expect a higher level of academic rigor." The room fell silent, the weight of Mrs. Anderson's words pressing down on everyone. Some students stared at their desks, unwilling to meet Nadia's eyes. Others watched with a mixture of horror and fascination, unsure of how to respond. Nadia's jaw tightened, her fists clenching beneath the desk. Her voice wavered slightly, but she forced herself to speak. "I respectfully disagree, Mrs. Anderson. Ignoring the racial themes in To Kill a Mockingbird undermines the author's intent and does a disservice to the text." "Enough," Mrs. Anderson snapped, her face flushing with anger. "Your attitude is bordering on insubordination. Sit down and reflect on whether you're truly prepared for the standards of this class." Nadia gathered her materials slowly, the weight of humiliation pressing down on her. As she returned to her seat, a small voice from the back of the room broke the silence. "I thought Nadia's presentation was excellent," Michael, a usually quiet student, said hesitantly. Mrs. Anderson whirled around, her eyes narrowing. "And what would you know about literary analysis, Mr. Green? Perhaps you'd like to join Miss Lewis in detention to discuss your own academic shortcomings." Michael shrank back, his face reddening. The rest of the class remained silent, their expressions a mixture of fear and discomfort. Mrs. Anderson turned back to Nadia, her gaze cold. "Well, sit down so we can move on to presentations actually worth our time." Nadia sank into her chair, her face burning with a mixture of anger and shame. She could feel the eyes of her classmates on her, some sympathetic, others cruelly amused. She took slow, steady breaths, willing herself not to break. The class continued, but Nadia's mind was racing. She knew she couldn't let Mrs. Anderson's behavior go unchallenged, but the teacher held all the power. Speaking out would only lead to further humiliation, or so she thought. The tension was shattered when the classroom door opened and a tall figure stepped inside. "I apologize for the interruption," said the newcomer, his deep voice cutting through the room like a knife. "May I have a moment?" The man was dressed in a sharp suit, his presence commanding attention. Nadia's heart skipped a beat as recognition dawned. It was her father, Principal Lewis. Mrs. Anderson's lips curled into a smug smile, oblivious to the connection between the two. "Of course, Principal Lewis," she said, her voice saccharine. "We were just finishing up a presentation. How can I assist you?" Principal Lewis's gaze swept the room before settling on Nadia. A flicker of concern crossed his face, but his voice remained calm. "I understand you've requested a parent-teacher conference regarding one of your students. I'd like to discuss the matter further." Mrs. Anderson's smile widened, clearly pleased. "Absolutely. I've had some concerns about Miss Lewis's performance and attitude that I think are worth addressing." "Miss Lewis?" Principal Lewis asked, his tone neutral. "Which Miss Lewis might that be?" Mrs. Anderson gestured dismissively toward Nadia. "This one right here? I assume there's no relation?" she added with a chuckle, completely unaware of her mistake. Principal Lewis's expression remained unreadable. "Actually," he said, his voice carrying a quiet intensity, "she's my daughter." The color drained from Mrs. Anderson's face as the implications of his words sank in. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. The smug confidence that had carried her through the conversation evaporated in an instant. I had no idea," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Clearly," Principal Lewis replied, his tone measured but firm. "But ignorance is no excuse for the behavior you've displayed. I think it's time we had a more private conversation." Mrs. Anderson nodded numbly, gathering her materials with jerky movements. Principal Lewis turned back to the class, his gaze softening slightly as it landed on Nadia. "Students," he said, addressing the room, "please continue with your assigned reading. Mrs. Anderson and I will be stepping out for a moment." As the two adults left the classroom, The room buzzed with hushed whispers. Nadia sat quietly, her emotions swirling. Relief, vindication, and a lingering sense of defiance warred within her. She knew the confrontation wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt like justice was within reach. Outside the classroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension as Mrs. Anderson led Principal Lewis to a nearby conference room. Her heels clicked sharply against the tiled floor, a sound that betrayed her growing unease. Once inside, she turned to face him, forcing a tight, professional smile onto her face. "Principal Lewis, I appreciate you taking the time to address this matter," she began, her voice tinged with an attempt at authority. "I've been quite concerned about Nadia's performance and her disruptive behavior in my class." Principal Lewis's expression remained calm, but his posture radiated authority. He gestured for Mrs. Anderson to continue, his silence prompting her to fill the void. "She consistently challenges the curriculum," Mrs. Anderson said, her tone growing more animated. "She insists on injecting her personal views into discussions, which derails the lessons I've carefully prepared. And her attitude—" She threw her hands up in exasperation. "It's clear she has no respect for authority or the academic standards we uphold here at Westwood Academy." As Mrs. Anderson spoke, Principal Lewis's eyes narrowed slightly, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. He remained silent, allowing her to continue digging her own grave. "For instance," she pressed on, "just today, her presentation completely missed the broader literary merits of To Kill a Mockingbird. She focused almost exclusively on racial themes, ignoring the universal aspects of the novel. It was highly inappropriate." Principal Lewis finally raised an eyebrow, his voice calm but laced with a quiet intensity. "And you believe that focusing on racial themes is inappropriate when discussing a novel centered around a racially charged trial?" Mrs. Anderson faltered, caught off guard by the question. "Well, of course, those themes are part of the story, but I think it's important to emphasize universal ideas that transcend individual experiences. Otherwise, we risk alienating the students." "I see," Principal Lewis replied, his tone measured. "And how exactly has Nadia been disruptive? Can you provide specific examples?" Mrs. Anderson straightened, regaining some of her earlier confidence. "Certainly. She often raises her hand to challenge points I make in class, argues with other students during discussions, and her body language, her defiance, it's clear she doesn't respect my authority." Principal Lewis leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharp. "Mrs. Anderson, have you considered that what you perceive as defiance might actually be critical thinking? After all, isn't encouraging students to analyze and challenge ideas a cornerstone of education?" Mrs. Anderson blinked, momentarily at a loss for words. I suppose I hadn't thought of it that way. But you must understand, Principal Lewis, Nadia's behavior suggests she isn't a good fit for Westwood's rigorous environment. Perhaps her previous school didn't prepare her adequately for the standards we uphold here." At this, Principal Lewis's jaw visibly tightened. He took a deep breath before responding, his voice steady but firm. "Mrs. Anderson, I think it's time I clarified something for you. Nadia's previous education was exceptional. In fact, I can personally vouch for it." Mrs. Anderson frowned, confusion evident on her face. "I'm not sure I understand. How can you personally?" Her words trailed off as realization dawned. Principal Lewis's eyes locked onto hers, unwavering. "I can vouch for her education because I'm the one who oversaw it. Nadia is my daughter." The color drained from Mrs. Anderson's face as the implications of his words sank in. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. The smug confidence that had carried her through the conversation evaporated in an instant. I had no idea," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Clearly," Principal Lewis replied, his tone carrying a weight that made her flinch. "But ignorance is no excuse for the behavior you've displayed toward my daughter, or I suspect, toward other students who don't fit your preconceived notions of what a good student looks like." Mrs. Anderson stumbled backward slightly, her hand gripping the edge of the desk for support. She opened her mouth to defend herself, but Principal Lewis held up a hand, silencing her. "Your actions have demonstrated a clear pattern of bias and discrimination," he continued, his voice rising slightly. "Not only have you singled out Nadia unfairly, but your comments suggest a deeper issue, one that goes beyond a single student." Principal Lewis, please, Mrs. Anderson began, her voice trembling. I can explain. I think you've explained enough, he interrupted, his patience wearing thin. For now, we'll address this matter formally. But first, I'll be observing your class for the remainder of the day. I'm very interested in seeing your teaching methods firsthand. Mrs. Anderson nodded numbly, gathering her materials with shaky hands. Together, they returned to the classroom, where the atmosphere shifted palpably as soon as they entered. Back in the classroom, the students straightened in their seats, sensing the tension between the two adults. Principal Lewis addressed the room with a calm yet commanding presence. Class, he began, his gaze sweeping across the students. I believe it's important that we have an open discussion about respect, diversity, and the true purpose of education. Mrs. Anderson stood rigidly by her desk, her earlier confidence completely gone. Her eyes darted nervously between Principal Lewis and the students. It has come to my attention, Principal Lewis continued, that there have been some concerning incidents in this class, incidents that go against the values we uphold at Westwood Academy. A collective intake of breath rippled through the students. Some cast furtive glances at Nadia, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Mrs. Anderson, Principal Lewis said, turning to the teacher, would you care to explain why you felt it necessary to consistently undermine and belittle one of your students? Mrs. Anderson's mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked around the room, searching for support, but found only shocked and disappointed faces staring back at her. Let me be clear, Principal Lewis said, his tone growing sharper. Your behavior toward Nadia, and I suspect toward other students who don't conform to your narrow worldview, is not only unprofessional, but deeply harmful. Principal Lewis, if I could just explain, Mrs. Anderson tried to interject, her voice trembling. Explain what, exactly? He cut her off, his voice carrying an edge of anger. Explain how you mocked Nadia's analysis because it focused on racial themes. Explain why you consistently ignored her raised hand during class discussions. Or perhaps you'd like to explain your comment about her previous education being lacking, simply because she doesn't fit your preconceived notions? The room was deathly silent, the weight of Principal Lewis's words settling over everyone like a heavy blanket. He turned back to the students, his voice softening slightly. Class, I want you to understand something. Education is not about silencing voices or dismissing perspectives that challenge our own. It's about expanding our understanding, engaging in respectful dialogue, and learning from diverse experiences. Nadia sat quietly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. For the first time in weeks, she felt truly seen and vindicated. Discrimination has no place in this classroom or in this school, Principal Lewis concluded firmly, and it stops today. The classroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as Principal Lewis's words hung in the air. Mrs. Anderson stood frozen, her face pale and her hands trembling slightly. The confident persona she had projected for weeks had crumbled under the weight of the truth. Mrs. Anderson, Principal Lewis said, his tone firm but calm, your actions have demonstrated a pattern of behavior that is unacceptable in any learning environment. You've created a classroom where certain voices are silenced and others are elevated, not based on merit but on your own biases. This will not be tolerated. The teacher opened her mouth, searching for a response, but no words came out. Instead, she stared at her feet, the reality of the situation sinking in. For now, Principal Lewis continued, you're relieved of your duties in this classroom. I will personally oversee the remainder of today's lessons. Afterward, we'll have a formal meeting to address these issues with the school board. Mrs. Anderson's hands tightened into fists at her sides, but she nodded. Her voice, when it came, was barely audible. Yes, Principal Lewis. As she gathered her belongings, her movements jerky and uncoordinated, the students watched in stunned silence. Some exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from shock to relief. Mrs. Anderson turned to leave, but Principal Lewis stopped her with one final remark. And Mrs. Anderson, he said, his voice carrying a note of finality, consider this your opportunity to reflect. Ignorance is not an excuse, but change begins with acknowledging our faults. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and without another word, she walked out of the classroom, her shoulders slumped. The door closed behind her with a heavy thud, leaving the room silent once more. After a brief pause, Principal Lewis stepped to the front of the room, his presence commanding attention. He took a deep breath, visibly calming himself, before addressing the class. "Students," he began, his voice softer now, "I want to apologize for what you've had to witness. The behavior you've seen in this classroom is not representative of Westwood Academy's values. This school strives to be a place where every student feels seen, heard, and respected." A few students nodded, their expressions thoughtful. Nadia sat quietly, her gaze fixed on the principal. "What's happened here," he continued, "is a painful reminder of the work we still need to do to ensure our school lives up to its mission. Discrimination, whether explicit or implicit, has no place in this community. But change doesn't happen on its own. It requires all of us to stand together, to listen, and to learn." He paused, letting his words sink in. "If any of you have ever felt silenced or disrespected, I want you to know that my door is always open. Your voices matter." The tension in the room began to ease as the students absorbed his words. Some glanced at Nadia, their expressions shifting from curiosity to empathy. "For now," Principal Lewis said, his tone lightening slightly, "I'd like us to continue with the lesson. Let's revisit the themes of To Kill a Mockingbird, a story that, as we've seen, still holds important lessons about justice, courage, and the fight against prejudice." He picked up the discussion where it had left off, guiding the students through an analysis of the text. This time, Nadia found herself an active participant. Principal Lewis called on her frequently, encouraging her insights and validating her contributions. The other students began to follow his lead, engaging in the discussion with renewed energy. Michael, the quiet student who had defended Nadia earlier, spoke up again, his voice more confident now. "I think what Nadia said about moral courage makes a lot of sense," he offered. Elena, sitting near the front, chimed in. "Yeah, and it's not just about race, it's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard." The classroom dynamic had shifted. Where there had once been tension and division, a sense of unity and collaboration began to take root. At the end of the day, Principal Lewis dismissed the class early, offering students time to reflect on what had happened. As they filed out, many paused to speak with Nadia. "I'm sorry for not saying anything sooner," Elena said softly, her eyes downcast. "I should have stood up for you." Nadia offered a small smile. "It's okay. I understand it's not always easy to speak up, but thank you for saying something now." Michael approached next. His cheeks flushed. "Your presentation was really good," he said, his voice earnest. "I don't get why Mrs. Anderson was so harsh." "Thanks, Michael," Nadia replied. "It means a lot to hear that." As the students continued to leave, a ripple of applause began to build in the hallway. Nadia stepped out to find a small group of classmates clapping for her, their support tangible. For the first time in weeks, Nadia felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The isolation and frustration she had endured began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of empowerment. Meanwhile, in the administrative office, Mrs. Anderson faced the consequences of her actions. The school board had convened an emergency meeting to review Principal Lewis's report. "Mrs. Anderson," one board member said sternly, "the evidence presented by Principal Lewis paints a troubling picture. Your behavior toward Nadia Lewis was not only unprofessional, but discriminatory. Such conduct is unacceptable." Mrs. Anderson shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I understand," she said quietly. "I let my biases affect my judgment. It won't happen again." "Unfortunately," the board member replied, "this isn't just about a single incident. It's clear there's a pattern here, and we must take decisive action to uphold the integrity of this institution." Within hours, the decision was made. Mrs. Anderson was dismissed from her position, and her career at Westwood Academy was effectively over. The next morning, as Nadia walked through the school's hallways, she noticed a palpable shift in the atmosphere. Students who had once avoided her now offered friendly smiles and waves. Conversations about diversity and inclusion buzzed in small groups. In the English classroom, now led by a substitute teacher, the energy was different. The oppressive tension that had once defined the space was gone, replaced by an air of openness and mutual respect. During lunch, Nadia found herself surrounded by classmates eager to hear her thoughts on how to make the school more inclusive. Ideas flowed freely, diversifying the curriculum, establishing mentorship programs, and hosting workshops on cultural awareness. For the first time, Nadia felt truly heard and valued. The morning after Mrs. Anderson's dismissal marked a new beginning for Nadia Lewis and Westwood Academy. The echoes of change were evident in every corner of the school. Students whispered excitedly about what had transpired, their conversations no longer tinged with fear or discomfort, but with curiosity and hope. As Nadia walked through the halls, she was greeted by smiles and nods of acknowledgement. Students who had previously ignored her now offered friendly waves. The atmosphere was lighter, as though a heavy cloud had been lifted. In her first period English class, Nadia entered to find a new substitute teacher, Mrs. Hale, standing at the front of the room. The substitute's warm demeanor was a stark contrast to Mrs. Anderson's harsh authority. "Good morning, everyone," Mrs. Hale began, her tone cheerful. "I'm excited to be working with you all for the next few weeks while we adjust to some changes. Let's start with a quick review of To Kill a Mockingbird. I'd love to hear your thoughts." For a moment, the class was hesitant, the weight of the previous week still fresh in their minds. But when Mrs. Hale called on Nadia, her response set a new tone for the discussion. "I think the novel's themes of justice and moral courage are timeless," Nadia said, her voice steady but thoughtful. "It challenges us to confront our own biases and stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult." Mrs. Hale nodded, her expression encouraging. "That's a fantastic observation, Nadia. Would anyone like to add to that?" Slowly, other students began to raise their hands. Michael shared how he related to the struggles of speaking out, while Elena elaborated on the importance of empathy in understanding the novel's characters. The discussion blossomed into a collaborative exploration of ideas, a stark contrast to the tense, one-sided lessons of the past. At lunch, Nadia found herself surrounded by classmates eager to engage with her. "Do you think we could do something to make the school more inclusive?" Elena asked, her eyes bright with determination. "I think so," Nadia replied. "But it can't just be one person. Change needs to come from everyone." Ideas flowed freely as they brainstormed ways to improve the school's culture. Michael suggested starting a cultural awareness club, while others proposed bringing in speakers to discuss diversity and inclusion. Nadia felt a swell of pride and gratitude. For weeks, she had felt like an outsider, her voice drowned out by prejudice. Now she was at the center of a movement, surrounded by peers who wanted to make a difference. Meanwhile, Principal Lewis worked tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure that what had happened in Mrs. Anderson's classroom would never be repeated. The school's leadership team convened to address the situation. Principal Lewis outlined a series of new initiatives aimed at fostering a more inclusive environment. "First," he announced, "we will be implementing mandatory diversity training for all staff. Education is about more than just academics. It's about creating a safe and respectful space for every student." The team nodded in agreement, their expressions resolute. "Second," he continued, "we'll be revising the curriculum to include more diverse perspectives. Literature and history shouldn't just reflect one narrative. They should open students' eyes to the complexity of the world around them." The final initiative involved creating a student-led council to address concerns related to equity and inclusion. "The voices of our students must guide this change," Principal Lewis emphasized. As the weeks passed, these changes began to take shape. The diversity training sessions sparked difficult but necessary conversations among the faculty, prompting many to reflect on their own biases. In the classroom, the revised curriculum introduced students to works by authors from a wide range of backgrounds. Discussions grew richer and more nuanced as students engaged with perspectives they had never encountered before. The Cultural Awareness Club, spearheaded by Nadia and her classmates, quickly became one of the school's most popular organizations. They hosted events celebrating different cultures, organized mentorship programs, and facilitated open dialogues about identity and inclusion. One afternoon, Nadia stood before a packed auditorium, addressing her peers at the club's first major event. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "But every step we take brings us closer to a school where everyone feels valued and heard. It's not just about fixing what's broken, It's about building something better." The crowd erupted into applause, and Nadia felt a surge of hope. For Nadia, the journey had been transformative. She had entered Westwood Academy feeling like an outsider, facing prejudice and exclusion at every turn. But her courage and resilience had sparked a ripple effect, inspiring others to confront their own biases and work toward a more inclusive community. One afternoon, as she walked out of the school building with her father, Principal Lewis placed a hand on her shoulder. "You've done something incredible, Nadia," he said, his voice filled with pride. "What happened here isn't just about one classroom or one teacher. It's a reminder that change is possible, but it takes courage to speak up." Nadia nodded thoughtfully. "I just hope it makes a difference beyond today. There are so many others who face the same challenges, both in school and outside of it." "It will," her father assured her. "You've shown people what's possible. That's how movements start, with one voice that refuses to be silenced." As Nadia's story spread through the school, it became a source of inspiration for students and faculty alike. The events at Westwood Academy served as a powerful reminder of the importance of standing up against injustice, no matter how deeply entrenched it may seem. The cultural awareness initiatives continued to grow, and the school became a model for other institutions striving to create inclusive environments. For Nadia, the experience was a testament to the power of resilience and the impact one person can have in driving change. Months after Mrs. Anderson's dismissal, Westwood Academy had become a different school. The changes initiated during that pivotal time had taken root, transforming the culture in ways no one could have imagined. Students and staff alike reflected on the events that had unfolded in the English classroom, seeing them as a catalyst for growth. Nadia Lewis, once a quiet newcomer, had become a leader and symbol of resilience. The Cultural Awareness Club she co-founded had blossomed into a driving force for inclusion and diversity on campus. Its activities ranged from hosting international festivals to inviting guest speakers to share their stories of overcoming prejudice. The club's most ambitious project, a school-wide diversity week, had recently concluded, leaving students buzzing with excitement and newfound understanding. Bookmark. One afternoon, Nadia sat with her closest friends in the library, planning the club's next event. "I was thinking we could do a mentorship program for incoming students," Michael suggested. "Something to make sure no one feels isolated the way you did when you first came here." Nadia smiled. "I love that idea. We could pair them with upperclassmen to help them adjust, and it could be a chance to promote inclusivity right from the start." Elena chimed in. Her enthusiasm was palpable. "And maybe we could create a handbook for teachers too. Something to help them incorporate diverse perspectives into their lessons." The group nodded in agreement, their shared passion driving the conversation forward. For Nadia, these moments were a stark contrast to the isolation she had felt during her first weeks at Westwood. She had found her place and, more importantly, had helped others find theirs as well. Outside the classroom, the broader impact of the changes was becoming evident. The school's newly revised curriculum included literature from a wide array of voices and works by authors of color, LGBTQ+ writers, and other historically underrepresented groups. These additions sparked rich, meaningful discussions in classrooms, challenging students to think critically about their own perspectives and biases. "It's amazing how much we've been missing," Elena said during a lunch break one day. "Reading these stories, it feels like we're finally getting the full picture." Nadia nodded. "That's the point. When we only hear one side of the story, we're not really learning. But now, we're getting closer to what education is supposed to be." Even teachers had embraced the shift. Diversity training sessions, while initially met with some resistance, had encouraged many to reflect on their own teaching practices. Faculty members began collaborating to create more inclusive lesson plans, fostering a sense of community and shared purpose. For Principal Lewis, these changes were deeply personal. As he walked the halls of Westwood Academy, he often paused to observe the subtle but profound differences in the school's atmosphere. He saw students from different backgrounds working together in ways they hadn't before. He overheard conversations about justice, empathy, and the importance of challenging unfairness. One afternoon, he was approached by Mrs. Hale, the substitute who had temporarily taken over Mrs. Anderson's English class. "I just wanted to thank you for the opportunity to step in," she said. "What happened here? It's remarkable. You don't see transformations like this every day." Principal Lewis smiled. "It's been a collective effort, but it all started with one voice that refused to stay silent." Mrs. Hale nodded thoughtfully. "Nadia is extraordinary. I hope she realizes just how much of a difference she's made." "She does," Principal Lewis replied, his tone filled with pride. "But I think she's also starting to understand that this is just the beginning." For Nadia, the journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every challenge. She often reflected on how far she had come, not just in standing up to Mrs. Anderson, but in finding her own strength and purpose. One evening, as she sat at the dinner table with her father, she brought up a question that had been on her mind. "Do you think it's possible for change to last?" she asked. "I mean, what if things go back to the way they were after I graduate?" Principal Lewis set down his fork, his expression thoughtful. "Change is a process, Nadia. It's not something that happens overnight, and it's not something that ends when one person leaves. What you've done here has laid the groundwork for something bigger. The real question is, how will the people who come after you build on it?" Nadia considered his words, her brow furrowed in thought. "I guess it's about inspiring others to keep pushing forward, isn't it?" "Exactly," her father said. "Leadership isn't just about what you do, it's about what you inspire others to do." The following week, Nadia had the opportunity to put that lesson into action. She was invited to speak at a regional student leadership conference, where she shared her story with an audience of peers and educators from across the district. Standing on the stage, Nadia felt a surge of nervous energy, but she channeled it into her speech. "When I first came to Westwood Academy, I thought I had to fight my battles alone," she began. "But I learned that change doesn't happen in isolation. It takes a community of people willing to listen, to learn, and to stand up for what's right." She recounted the challenges she had faced, the support she had received, and the lessons she had learned along the way. By the time she finished, the audience was on its feet, applauding with enthusiasm. Afterward, several students approached her, sharing their own experiences and thanking her for inspiring them. "You gave me hope," one girl said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I've been dealing with something similar at my school, and now I feel like I can finally speak up." Nadia smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "You can, and you'll be surprised how many people will stand with you once you do." As the school year came to a close, Westwood Academy felt like a different place. The changes Nadia had helped ignite continued to grow, fueled by the passion and determination of students and staff alike. But for Nadia, the most rewarding part of the journey was seeing the ripple effect of her actions. She watched as her classmates found their voices, as teachers embraced new ways of thinking, and as the school community became stronger and more united. One day, as she walked past Mrs. Anderson's now empty classroom, she paused, reflecting on how far they had come. What had started as a single act of defiance had blossomed into a movement, one that would leave a lasting impact on Westwood Academy for years to come. Nadia's story serves as a powerful reminder of the impact one person can have in the face of injustice. Through her courage and resilience, she not only stood up for herself, but also inspired a community to confront its biases and strive for a more inclusive future. At Westwood Academy, her legacy endures, a testament to the power of determination, empathy, and the belief that change is always possible. The story of Nadia Lewis at Westwood Academy is a powerful reminder of how prejudice can lurk in the places we least expect, even in institutions dedicated to learning and growth. It challenges us to reflect on the subtle ways discrimination can manifest, and the courage it takes to confront those injustices. Nadia's journey demonstrates that standing up for what is right often comes with immense challenges, but it can lead to transformative change, not just for individuals but for entire communities. Mrs. Anderson's behavior highlighted a deep-seated bias, but her downfall wasn't just about punishment. It was a moment of reckoning for the school. It forced everyone, from students to staff, to question their assumptions, reflect on their actions, and commit to building a better environment. Nadia's resilience and determination served as a beacon, inspiring others to find their voice and advocate for a more inclusive and compassionate world. The story teaches us that change begins with individuals willing to take a stand, even when the odds seem insurmountable. It's a lesson in the power of education, not just as a tool for academic achievement, but as a means to challenge unfair systems, promote empathy, and build bridges between diverse perspectives. For viewers, this story serves as both an inspiration and a call to action. It reminds us that we each have a role to play in creating spaces where everyone feels valued and respected. Nadia's triumph is a testament to what can happen when courage meets opportunity, and when people refuse to be silent in the face of injustice. If this story moves you, let us know. Comment 1 if you found it inspiring, and 2 if it deeply resonated with you. We'd love to hear your own stories of resilience and courage. Share them with us in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss more stories like this, filled with powerful lessons and uplifting moments. Let us know your thoughts about Nadia's journey and what it taught you. Together, we can create a community of inspiration, learning, and change.